Okay, so what we're going to do is re-emphasize and show one new way of, once you've created a GitHub repo, how to clone it to your own local machine so then you could begin working on it. So let's say that we have a GitHub repo that maybe you've created using code spaces. And you've done some work on it, so now you want to be able to maybe work on it locally on your own laptop or desktop using Visual Studio Code. So we'll kind of walk through another brief little example of how you might go about doing that from scratch. So here in GitHub, let's maybe create, once we've logged in, a brand new repository, right? When you guys are doing this, you might have something like homework, assignment, X. So typically I'm going to always give you the name of the repository. Maybe you could add in a brief description. This is a test dummy repo that I will delete after. We will make this public because again, we're trying to build up our repository to showcase for potential employers. You could add a README if you want. We'll be working more with the .gitignore later, but still just good to add it to get used to seeing it. You can choose a license if you want. License it to myself or to do Apache license is fine. Great. Then we'll say create repo. So before I hit submit, just remember that repository name, no white spaces. Want to minimize the use of special characters and either use hyphens hyphens, dashes, or underscores to remove any white space, because that will potentially give you issues working locally or when we're in Linux or whatever our operating system of choice might be. So we'll hit create repository, we'll give that a second, and now we have a brand new repository. Now, one of the workflows that we had learned, which I think is quite nifty and good, and once you have your student GitHub account access set up, when you right-click code here, you will then be able to, say, use GitHub code spaces to create a virtual environment, a virtual server that's hosted by GitHub with VS Code pre-installed, with Python and some of the core packages, so you don't really need to worry about much. And then it will automatically clone the repository for you. So there's no need to do git clone in this remote environment. So if we here click create code space on main, and main just refers to main branch, once we wait here for a second, it's now cloning the repository automatically within a new GitHub code space environment. It'll just give it some random name. So here it's called legendary lamp, PJP, etc. And then on the left-hand side here, we could see this is our repo, right? This is what is contained within the repository. This is that gitignore file. This is the license we had selected, Apache 2. And then this is the generic README that it had created. And that's it. Now, since this is a new environment, and if we want to make this IDE, Visual Studio Code, a little bit more effective, we might potentially, install some of the Python-related packages or Python-related plugins to, superpower our virtual VS Code environment here. So, we'll install some of these recommended ones, maybe just the Python debugger in Python and Pylance, and it looks like those all sort of come together. Then we could also maybe, let's see, is it recommending anything else? No? All right, so for this basic example, we're okay with just having Python. So that's under this extensions. On the left-hand side, the extensions icon, so these little blocks. So now if we go back to the paper icon to go to our sort of working directory, we could sort of close off, if we want, all of these tabs, and this is what it will look like by default. We have nothing inside of the repository other than these 3 files that were created. Now, typically in your homework assignment, right, I'll have you create a Python file. So maybe let's do one here. So I click into this window in the far left, right click, new file. Maybe I'll call this, homework, 2.py. Inside of this, right, we'll typically be working, say, with pandas, and then maybe we'll load in some type of, data frame, insert here, .csv, and then, we will then do some type of code modification to it. Okay, so let's say that this is our simple homework assignment. It's done. Now, what we need to do is our 3 commands that I've emphasized a lot: git add, git commit, and git push. And we'll learn other ways of doing these 3 commands outside of the terminal, but I think it's important to begin to gain some familiarity, and this is a good way of practicing working within the terminal. Even though VS Code can potentially do some of these commands for us, we'll first learn how to do it the traditional way. So now inside of our terminal, what we could then do is you will say git add followed by a period or a decimal, and then that will sort of track all of the files that exist within this repository that was automatically cloned for us by GitHub. And then we'll hit enter. Great, no errors. Then we'll say git commit -m, which is short for message. Then we'll add in some type of human readable message. This is my first commit to this fake repo, and that should be in quotes or single quotes. Just needs to be a string with open and closing single quotes or double quotes. Then we will hit enter. Great, no error. We get a message, 1 file changed, 5 insertions, and then we've created this thing called homework 2. Now our final command, and just to jump over quickly, right, to our github.com view of this, right, nothing has yet been pushed. This new Python file is only going to be pushed over to our github.com once we've done the last command, which is git push. So now once we type git push and then hit enter, we will see, great, it's done some stuff, it's pushed it over. And part of this is we never needed to log in to the terminal using GitHub or say an access token or anything like that, because the GitHub Codespace environment already knows who we are. We're already logged in, so it's smart and it brings over those credentials for us. Versus when you get your own local machine set up, you might need to sign in and authenticate in order to, say, push changes to a repository that you own, right? Because GitHub doesn't know, per se, if you're on your own computer or you're on someone else's computer. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so now if we go back over to our github.com to this fake assignment repo, and we do Command R, or we refresh the page, we now see here's homework_2.py. Great. Now, the question then that is coming up is, okay, now how can I also, say if you use GitHub Codespaces for this assignment, how can you bring it down to your own computer? How can you clone a copy of it to your own computer? And that's then where the first point I'm going to make is related to your own folder structure on your computer to re-emphasize. I would not recommend that you clone things to your downloads folder. As an example, again, to re-show what I've done under my documents, I have is it under documents? No, it's not under my documents. It's under my root folder haunts. I have created a folder which contains all of my development projects or coding projects. So I've created a folder called development. You guys can maybe just create something called AHI or coding, whatever. It's your own personal preference. And then I sort of further subdivide things by the type of code or the sort of base code. So for all of my Python GitHub repos, I've created a Python folder. And if I were to scroll through here, and we could see that these are all, if we were to click into one, that these are all a variety of different projects that I'm working on, or some of our classroom repositories. This is where I keep them all local. So I think one of the easier ways to first do this, so if you've already gotten VS Code installed, great, we'll go through that way later. GitHub has a tool called GitHub Desktop. And what this enables you to do is more easily work with and clone repositories to your own computer, and then do git commits and pushes and all of that other fun stuff. I'll also expose you to another tool called GitKraken, which is a more advanced version that you also get for free with your .student or your .edu account. But for right now, this one's easy and it's free to everybody. So there's no need to do any sign up or payment and stuff like that. So I'm going to download this. If you're on a PC, it should automatically show you the appropriate operating system. We'll give this a second. It will install, and I don't believe I have this installed on my computer right now. I must have deleted it. So we'll be able to go through the installation process, how it will likely look for yourself. So we'll unzip this, just double click. If you're on a PC, right, it'll be kind of similar. And I believe that this is just a small little standalone application. So for me on the Mac here, what I'll probably just do is then drag and drop this application outside of my downloads, and I would probably move it into my applications folder because it's an application that looks like, there's no installation package. It's just straight up the app. And it's called GitHub Desktop. Here it is. So now if I double click this, let's see what happens. Are you sure you want to open? Yep, open. I see the little bouncy icon on the bottom of my screen, so we'll just give this a second. It's probably just doing its thing, probably seeing what's already installed or what needs to be installed. Okay, so here's what then pops up. Sign into github.com or sign into GitHub Enterprise. So we are just going to sign into github.com. So all of us have already created our GitHub accounts. So we just hit sign in, and then what it probably will do is it's going to open up the default web browser on your own computer. So on mine, I guess it's Safari since I'm on a Mac, and then we log in. So I got sort of passkey set up since I'm on a Mac. And then it'll ask us, hey, let's give it permission to whatever it needs access to. You could only give it to public or private or both. And this is fine. You just give it access to everything because it's just going to be running on your own local computer. And then we will hit allow. So then it should redirect us back to GitHub Desktop, and then it should probably show us, yep, our credentials. Which is correct. Use my GitHub account name and email. So let's just have them configure it for us, and then we'll hit finish. Okay, great. So you guys could probably go through the tutorial if you want to, but what we'll now see here is these are all of our repositories, not locally, but on github.com. So what we then want to do is, clone one of these repositories, specifically the one that I just created here, Homework Assignment X, to my own machine. And specifically, you guys will want to identify a specific folder. Again, like I said, mine's is Python. I have a folder called Python. That's outside of my downloads. That's outside of my documents. It's in a specific, place on my machine where it's not going to accidentally get deleted, and it's easy for me to find. So our goal is to clone this Homework Assignment X and then clone it to this Python folder. So if we go back here to this GitHub, what we could click here is clone a repository from the internet. And then here we could see we could clone repos from github.com, GitHub Enterprise, or some other URL. We can learn more about that stuff later. And then here it looks like this is like a local path for if you're going to use GitHub Desktop, and maybe you just use this by default. You know, this seems like a pretty logical place to potentially save the local versions of your GitHub repos. So just for the sake of demonstration, we'll just use this default location. So you're going to then see once we've cloned, and let's search here. We called this, what, homework assignment X. So I'm going to just click on that. So it's highlighted. And then we can now see it's now saying documents/GitHub/ the name of the repository. So when you clone the repository to your machine, it takes the name of the repo and it's going to use that name to create the folder. So very important, again, with the whole naming convention and not using any white spaces, because when we do stuff in Python, we try and navigate around different folders. White space makes our life difficult. We want to make our life easy. So then we'll hit the clone button. Cloning, cool. And this is it. So now it's saying, you know, and now if we were to navigate on my machine, right? So it said it did it under Documents, GitHub, and then voila, right? There's our new repo with the homework 2 that we created, the license, and the README. So then the idea is you would then have this GitHub folder, perhaps, right? If you want to use their default approach, that would then contain all of the different repos that you work on locally for this class, for 504 and for 507. And here, if you have VS Code installed, you know, let's see if this actually works. Let me close off my VS Code quick. And let's see what happens when we say open in VS Code. Because again, I already have this installed by default and it opened up on my other screen, but you'll then see here, right? This is now what we had created on github.com. Now let's say on my own local machine, we're gonna do some additional stuff, right? We learned about maybe df shape, df head, df tail. Let's see what else the AI is recommending for is df.describe for doing descriptive statistics for any of the columns that might be numerical, right? So now we've added some of these changes and then we've also then saved them, right? I've done Command S, you know, file save. But now let's say that we want to persist these changes back to github.com. So maybe I'll just close out of VS Code here for a second. And now when we navigate back to GitHub Desktop, you'll see that it's automatically detecting these changes. And then here, instead of doing it in the terminal, and we could still do it in the terminal if we want to, but maybe we'll just use this GitHub Desktop for a second. We could give it a message and also a description. So updated homework 2, great. Maybe, you know, added in some new lines to describe and, you know, analyze meta information about the data frame. So then we could hit this commit to main. Great. Now, this has only committed it and not yet pushed it. So we learned, you know, git add, git commit, and git push. GitHub Desktop is automatically observing all of the files and doing the git add command for us. We still then need to do this git commit part here. And then we also need to do the push. So here now it's actually giving us a little recommendation, push commits to origin remote. So remote means github.com. So if we now, just to kind of show you before we hit that, right, these changes have only thus far been committed locally. If we were to go into homework2.py, we don't have those new lines of code yet. But if we now hit push origin, we'll wait a second. Now it says everything is good to go. Now we go back here, do Command R to refresh the page. We'd see there was a new commit 1 minute ago, homework 2, go in here, and great. So that's again, brief little quick tutorial on how to use GitHub Desktop to clone things locally and then to also push those changes that you might have done on your own machine back to github.com.